The sun hung lazily in the sky over Ethan Walker's sprawling property, a peaceful 10-acre stretch of land on the outskirts of town. His gravel driveway curved elegantly from the main road to his rustic farmhouse, surrounded by rolling green fields and a sturdy wooden fence. Ethan had lived here for nearly a decade, enjoying the quiet solitude of country life, free from nosy neighbors and pointless rules. That is, until the HOA crept in like an uninvited pest. It had started when the neighboring subdivision expanded. Once a quiet cul-de-sac, the development had grown closer to Ethan's land. At first, it didn't bother him. People had the right to live where they pleased. But then came the demands, the ridiculous letters, and the so-called suggestions about how he should improve his property to match the aesthetic of their cookie-cutter homes. Ethan ignored them. His land wasn't part of the HOA, and he had no intention of letting them dictate what he did with it. But today was different. Ethan had just finished stacking firewood when a silver SUV rolled up to his gate. A woman stepped out, her pressed beige pants and perfectly styled bob screaming suburban superiority. He recognized her immediately, Margaret Kensington, the head of the HOA and the self-proclaimed ruler of the subdivision. She strutted up to the gate, arms crossed, a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Walker," she called, voice dripping with artificial politeness. "We need to have a conversation." Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans and sauntered over, leaning against the gate. "What can I do for you, Margaret?" She pursed her lips, as if merely speaking to him was beneath her. "As you know, the subdivision has grown, and our residents have been experiencing delays due to traffic congestion. Your driveway provides a much quicker route to the main road, and we would like to use it as an access point." Ethan blinked. "You want to use my driveway?" "Yes," she flipped a page on her clipboard. "We are requesting a copy of your gate key so our residents can pass through freely. It would save them time and prevent unnecessary traffic buildup." Ethan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "That's not happening." Margaret's expression darkened. "Mr. Walker, you are being unreasonable. The community would benefit greatly from this arrangement." "This isn't the community's land," Ethan replied firmly. "It's mine." Margaret exhaled sharply. "You'd be compensated, of course, a small stipend for your cooperation." Ethan crossed his arms, not interested. Her forced smile faltered. "I must warn you, refusing to cooperate may have consequences. We have legal avenues to ensure the community's needs are met." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You do whatever you think you need to, Margaret, but no one's getting a key to my property." Her eyes flashed with irritation before she composed herself. "I suggest you reconsider, Mr. Walker." With that, she spun on her heel, marching back to her SUV. The tires kicked up dust as she sped away. Ethan watched her leave, his mind already racing. He knew people like Margaret, entitled, relentless, convinced that rules bent to their will. She wasn't going to let this go. And neither was he. Ethan wasn't surprised when the harassment started. It began with letters, printed on official HOA letterhead, each one more aggressive than the last. The first was a friendly request to reconsider. The second mentioned community cooperation and how he should be a good neighbor. By the third, the language had shifted to warnings about how he was hindering community access and creating unnecessary inconvenience. He tossed every single one into the fireplace. Then came the unannounced visits. Margaret and her group of clipboard-wielding minions would show up at his gate, standing there like they had some kind of authority over him. Each time he greeted them with the same response, a firm no, before shutting the gate in their faces. But it was the latest stunt that truly infuriated him. Ethan had just finished fixing a section of his fence when he heard the distinct sound of tires crunching over gravel. He turned just in time to see a black SUV roll right up to his property, stopping inches from his closed gate. The backseat window rolled down, and Margaret leaned out, looking smug. Behind her, Ethan spotted two men in HOA-branded polos, standing near his fence, one of them holding what looked suspiciously like bolt cutters. His stomach knotted with anger. They were actually planning to break in. Ethan strode toward the gate, his boots kicking up dust. "Margaret," he greeted coolly, "something I can help you with." She didn't even look ashamed. "Mr. Walker, we've decided it's in the best interest of the community to move forward with our access request." She gestured toward the men. "We're installing a secondary entrance for emergency and convenience purposes." Ethan's grip tightened on the metal bars of his gate. "You mean you're trespassing?" Margaret sighed, shaking her head as if he were the unreasonable one. "No, Mr. Walker, we're ensuring community accessibility. This is for the good of everyone." The man with the bolt cutters stepped forward. Ethan moved faster. He unlatched the gate, swinging it open just enough to step through before slamming it shut behind him. He planted himself between Margaret's lackeys and his fence. "You cut that lock," he said, voice dangerously low, "and we'll have a real problem." Margaret huffed. "Mr. Walker, if you refuse to be cooperative, we'll have no choice but to escalate this to the county." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Go ahead. I'd love to see what law says I have to give you free access to my land." The man with the bolt cutters hesitated, glancing at Margaret. She pursed her lips before waving him off. "Fine," she said stiffly, "but this isn't over." She climbed back into her SUV, her minions following suit. As they drove off, Ethan stood there, fists clenched. He knew exactly what kind of people he was dealing with now. And if they thought they could push him around, they were about to get a very rude awakening. Ethan had dealt with stubborn people before, but Margaret and her HOA goons were a whole different breed of entitled. He knew they wouldn't give up, but he hadn't expected them to escalate so quickly. It started subtly. One morning he found his mailbox knocked over, as if someone had rammed it with a car. A few days later, a citation mysteriously appeared on his property, something about unauthorized fencing that didn't even apply to him since he wasn't in the HOA's jurisdiction. He ignored it, but the real breaking point came when he caught one of the HOA board members inside his fence, taking photos of his property. That was it. Ethan had just finished fixing a section of his barn when he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on gravel. He turned, and sure enough, there was a scrawny man in a tucked-in polo shirt, snapping pictures of his land like he had every right to be there. Ethan didn't say a word. He just strode forward, boots heavy against the dirt, until he was right behind the man. "Something interesting?" Ethan asked casually. The guy nearly jumped out of his skin, fumbling his phone. "Oh, I was just documenting, HOA business, sir." Ethan crossed his arms. "Funny, I don't remember agreeing to an inspection." The man swallowed hard. "We just need to make sure everything's up to community standards." Ethan took a step forward. "I'm not in your community." The man's face turned red. "Well, if you just complied, this would be easier." "Get off my land." The guy stammered out a weak protest, but Ethan just pointed toward the gate. After a few seconds of hesitation, the man scurried off like a rat. Ethan watched him go, jaw tight with anger. They weren't just annoying him anymore. They were violating his property. He knew Margaret was behind it all, pulling strings, sending people to intimidate him. But they'd just made a mistake. Because now Ethan was done playing nice. Ethan spent the evening sitting on his porch, sipping a beer and thinking. The HOA had pushed him too far. First, they had tried to force him into compliance with letters. Then they had attempted to break into his property. Now they were trespassing to find excuses to pressure him. They weren't going to stop until he made them. So he started planning. The first thing he did was install new security cameras, hidden well enough that Margaret's goons wouldn't notice them. If they set foot on his property again, he'd have proof of their trespassing. Next, he made a few calls, one to the county office to verify his property rights and another to a lawyer friend who confirmed what he already knew. The HOA had no legal claim over his land. If they pushed any further, they'd be the ones facing legal trouble. But Ethan didn't want to just stop them. He wanted to teach them a lesson. That's when the idea struck him. Margaret wanted access to his driveway. Fine. He'd give her exactly what she asked for, just not in the way she expected. The next morning, Ethan drove into town and picked up a few heavy-duty spike strips, the kind designed to stop vehicles in their tracks. He also grabbed some new no trespassing signs, big, bold, and legally binding. By the time he got back, he already had the perfect plan forming in his head. He spent the rest of the day preparing. He installed the spike strips on the inside of his gate, right where anyone unauthorized would drive over them. He made sure they were retractable, hidden when he needed them to be, but fully capable of stopping an unwanted car if Margaret or her HOA lackeys tried sneaking in. Finally, he set up a few dummy cameras near his gate, obvious enough to be seen. Let them think those were his only security measures. Let them feel bold enough to try again. Then he sat back and waited. It wasn't a matter of if Margaret would try again. It was a matter of when. Ethan didn't have to wait long. 2 days after setting up his spike strips and security cameras, he noticed tire tracks near his fence, tracks that hadn't been there the night before. Someone had been snooping around again. Then, just before noon, his suspicions were confirmed. Margaret arrived in her usual silver SUV, but this time she wasn't alone. She had 2 HOA board members with her, and worse, a tow truck. Ethan leaned against his porch railing, watching with mild amusement as Margaret, dressed in her usual pristine beige outfit, stood at his gate, clipboard in hand. The tow truck driver, a burly man with a look of disinterest, waited beside her, likely paid to enforce whatever ridiculous HOA stunt Margaret was about to pull. Ethan smirked. Oh, this was going to be good. Margaret wrapped her manicured nails against his metal gate before calling out, "Mr. Walker, this is your last opportunity to comply before we take further action." Ethan took his sweet time strolling down the driveway. "Margaret," he greeted lazily, stopping just short of the gate. "Didn't take you for the type to bring backup. Something got you nervous." Margaret's fake smile was firmly in place. "We've given you multiple chances to cooperate, but you've forced our hand. The HOA has decided to designate this driveway as an emergency access route for the neighborhood." She gestured to the tow truck driver. "If you refuse to provide a key, we will be removing the gate ourselves." Ethan whistled low. "That's so." Margaret nodded sharply. "Yes, we've already spoken with county officials. If you don't comply, we will take legal action." Ethan fought back a grin. "Legal action, huh?" She didn't notice the security camera blinking just above her head. She didn't notice the hidden spike strips waiting just inside the gate. And she certainly didn't notice the way Ethan casually reached for the control switch inside his pocket. "Well then, Margaret," Ethan drawled, stepping aside. "If you're so sure of yourself, by all means, go ahead." Margaret gave him a smug look before turning to the tow truck driver. "Proceed." The driver, not caring about the situation beyond his paycheck, shrugged and climbed into his truck. With a heavy groan, the tow truck lurched forward, rolling past the open gate. Ethan clicked the switch in his pocket. PSSSSSHHHH thunk. The moment the front tires hit the hidden spikes, both tires exploded. A loud bang echoed across the property as the truck lurched to a dead stop, its front end sagging under the weight of 2 instantly flattened tires. There was a brief silence. Then, "What the hell?" the tow truck driver roared, jumping out of the cab. "My damn tires." Margaret's face drained of color. What just happened?" Ethan leaned casually against the fence post, suppressing a grin. "Oh, I forgot to mention, I installed security measures to keep trespassers off my land." He turned to the driver. "Looks like your boss here forgot to mention that part." The tow truck driver rounded on Margaret. "You didn't tell me there were spikes. Who the hell's paying for this?" Margaret was stunned silent. Ethan chuckled. "Not my problem." He pointed at the security camera blinking above them. "But I got it all on camera, just in case you want to try filing a complaint. Pretty sure trespassing and attempted property damage won't look too good on an HOA record." Margaret's mouth opened and closed, her usual confidence shattered. She glanced at her clipboard, at the furious tow truck driver, and finally at Ethan, who was grinning ear to ear. For the first time since this all started, she had nothing to say. Ethan tipped his hat. "Better luck next time." Margaret was livid. Ethan watched as her face turned a deep shade of red, her hands shaking around her clipboard. The tow truck driver was still yelling, pointing angrily at the destroyed tires, demanding to know who was going to pay for the damage. One of the HOA board members tried to calm him down, but it was useless. He was too furious to listen. Margaret finally snapped out of her daze. This is illegal," she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at Ethan. "You sabotaged the road." Ethan chuckled. "Sabotage? No, Margaret, that's called private property protection. You should know all about rules, since you love them so much." She gritted her teeth. "You had no right." Ethan cut her off, pulling out his phone. "Actually, I had every right. See, I called the county office last week after your little bolt cutter stunt. Turns out they love hearing about HOAs overstepping their boundaries." He smirked. "I also made sure to install a few legal deterrents for trespassers. You know, like the spike strips you just found the hard way." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think this is funny?" Ethan shrugged. "I think it's hilarious." The tow truck driver, still fuming, turned back to Margaret. "So, who's paying for this?" Margaret swallowed hard. The HOA will cover it," she muttered through clenched teeth. One of her board members gasped. "Margaret, we can't." "We don't have a choice," she snapped before whipping back toward Ethan. "This isn't over, Walker. You can't just refuse to cooperate with the community." Ethan cocked an eyebrow. "Margaret, this isn't your community." She opened her mouth to argue, but Ethan took a step closer to the gate, dropping his friendly demeanor. "Let me make something real clear to you," he said, voice cold. "I don't care how many letters you send. I don't care how many people you bring to my property. I don't care what imaginary authority you think you have." His eyes locked onto hers. "You and your little HOA have no power here." Margaret's face twitched. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Ethan leaned against the fence. "But hey, if you want to keep pushing your luck, by all means, try again." Margaret stood there, completely silent. The weight of the tow truck repair costs, the security footage, and Ethan's unwavering defiance all crashed down on her at once. She turned sharply on her heel and stomped back toward her SUV, her lackeys scrambling to follow. The tow truck driver shot Ethan an approving look before calling his company for assistance. Ethan simply smiled and walked back toward his porch, satisfied. The HOA had just learned a very expensive lesson. And Ethan had a feeling Margaret wouldn't be trying this again anytime soon. For the first time since this nonsense started, the HOA was silent. No more letters, no more clipboard-wielding minions lurking around his fence, no more Margaret showing up to spew empty threats. It was as if they had collectively decided to pretend Ethan didn't exist. Which suited him just fine. But then, a few days later, something glorious happened. Ethan was in town picking up supplies when he overheard a conversation near the local diner. A group of residents from the HOA-controlled subdivision were huddled together, whispering furiously. The words misuse of funds and unauthorized expenses caught his attention. He grabbed his coffee and casually took a seat nearby, just within earshot. "Margaret used HOA funds to pay off that tow truck guy," one woman hissed. "It was over $1,000 in damages." Another man scoffed. "And she approved it without running it through the board first. That's against the bylaws." Ethan sipped his coffee, fighting back a grin. Oh, this just kept getting better. A third person shook their head. "It's not just that. People are talking about how she tried to break into some guy's property. If this gets out, the HOA could be in real trouble." Ethan had to bite his cheek to keep from laughing. Oh, it's getting out all right. By the time he finished his coffee, Margaret's little dictatorship was on the verge of collapse. The residents weren't happy about their HOA fees being used to clean up her mess. Rumors were spreading fast, and soon she wouldn't just be dealing with him. She'd be dealing with the entire neighborhood. Later that evening, Ethan sat on his porch, enjoying the peace. He didn't even need to do anything else. Margaret had practically set herself on fire with her own arrogance. And now, she was about to burn. It didn't take long for the fallout to hit Margaret like a freight train. The very next week, Ethan heard the news straight from one of the local hardware store clerks. Apparently, the HOA board had called an emergency meeting after multiple residents demanded answers about Margaret's unauthorized spending. Word had spread fast about the tow truck fiasco, and people were furious that their fees had been used to clean up her mess. Ethan could only imagine Margaret trying to talk her way out of it, stammering through excuses while her perfectly curated authority crumbled around her. And crumble it did. By the end of the meeting, Margaret had been removed as HOA president. The board had no choice but to cut ties with her to save face. But the real cherry on top. A few days later, Ethan received a letter, not from the HOA, but from Margaret herself. It was short and painfully formal, clearly written through clenched teeth. Mr. Walker, due to recent events, I will no longer be overseeing HOA operations in our community. As such, I respectfully withdraw any previous requests regarding your property. You will not be hearing from the HOA again. Sincerely, Margaret Kensington. Ethan read the letter twice, chuckled, then tacked it to his fridge like a trophy. He had won. The best part? His driveway remained untouched, his gate locked, and his land completely free from HOA interference. Just the way it always should have been. A week later, as he sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan took a deep breath of crisp evening air. Peace had finally returned. And if the HOA, or anyone else, ever thought about crossing him again, well, the spike strips were still there,